Welcome back to my channel Celeb Buzz. Please share and subscribe and press the bell icon for new updates. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's best friend. Every single night, millions of families let him come into their living rooms. He made them laugh, he made them smile. And he said goodnight to help put a whole count right bed with his famous goodbye. But here's what's going to shock you about the Montevarian thought they knew. When those TV cameras stopped working, when that famous curtain finally closed, Johnny Carson became one of the loneliest people in America. The king of late-night TV, the man who could make any own a law, who helped start careers with a single hand wave, spent his last 13 years like a ghost in his own life. Yurabuto learned how the most loved man on TV died almost completely alone. How? His own son's sad death broke Jim in ways people never saw. Why his closest friends were cut off forever best of fights he couldn't let go. A nesad truth about what really happened in those final, quiet years. This isn't the Johnny Carson story you'll think you know. This is the story of how being famous became like a jail and how the walls meet to keep him safe became the bars that trapped came until his last breath. Johnny Carson wasn't born to be the king of comedy. He was made by loneliness, shaped by being rejected, and formed by a childhood so cold it would follow him forth rest of his life. It all started in the small town of Norfolk, Nebraska, where a shy, quiet boy named John William Carson learned his first and most important lesson. Never let anyone need the real you. His mother, Ruth Carson, was the kind of woman who could make a room feel cold with a single look. Cold, mean, and far away with feelings. She treated love like something expensive she couldn't afford to give. Matter what Johnny did, good grades, great magic shows, being the perfect, well-behaved child, he never felt like heckled win her love. Years later, when Ruth died, Johnny made a choice of that, would shock everyone who knew him. He didn't go to her funeral. Instead, he told his lawyer something that showed how deep that childhood hurt was. He called her a wicked witch. But here's what shaped the Monwa would become America's most loved TV host. Young Johnny found magic tricks. First, it seems innocent enough. A lonely kid finding a hobby. But there's something deeper here that explains everything that come after. Magic gave Johnny something he rarely wanted. The ability to connect with people without showing his real feelings. He could perform, get laughs, win love, all while hiding behind tricks and magic. The real Johnny stayed safely locked away. His father, Homer, wasn't mean like Ruth, but he might as well have been invisible. Working as a power company boss, he was there in body, but not there with his feelings. Johnny learned early that the grown-ups in his life couldn't be counted on for warmth or love. So, the boy did what kids who survive do. He changed. He built walls. He learned to be charming from a distance, to entertain without showing who he really was. To make people laugh without letting them in. When World War II came, 18-year-old Johnny joined the Navy. You might think military service would break down those walls, create friendships with other soldiers. Instead, it met them higher. Johnny entertained his sailor friends with comedy and magic but hecked his distance from real friendships. The pattern was set. Performing wasaf, real connection, was dangerous. By the time he came back to Nebraska for college, studying radio and speech, Johnny Carson had perfected a skill that would make him famous and destroy his personal life. The art of being charming while staying completely hidden. But Joe Haven heard. Anything yet? Because Stellanly boy from Nebraska was about to become the most powerful man on TV? And that power would cost them everything that actually mattered. In 1962, at just 36 years old, Johnny Carson walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show and claimed a throne he would sit on for 3 decades. But here's what nobody understood at the time. He wasn't just becoming a TV host. He was disappearing behind the most successful mask in entertainment history. The genius of Johnny Carson wasn't just his timing or his jokes. It was his ability to make 20 million people feel like his best friend while never letting a single person actually know him. Think about this for a second. Johnny had a rule of thought. He would never meet his guests before they walked through that famous curtain. It's the official reason. He wanted a reaction on camera to be real. But the real reason was much darker. It was how he lived his entire life, even with people he worked with every single day. Johnny kept that wall firmly in place. his workers. People who spent decades by his side would later admit something that should make you feel cold. They never really knew him. He was polite, professional, even nice at times. But there was always that distance, that invisible wall nobody cooled. Cross. Ed McMahon, the man who sat next to Johnny for 30 years, once said that Johnny was great with millions of people, but terrible with just a few close relationships. But there's where it gets really interesting and it's heartbreaking. That same emotional distance that Madahim terrible at. Relationships made Haim absolutely brilliant on TV. Heckled read an audience because he was always studying people from the outside. He could time a joke perfectly. Because was always performing, never just being himself. The power he built up was amazing. At his peak, NBC was making off $55 million a year from his show. That's over $200 million in today's money. He didn't just host The Tonight Show, he owned it. Carson Production Scandal, the most valuable hour. ONTV. With a single hand wave, calling a comedian over to the couch after their act, Johnny could launch a career into the sky. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Jerry Seinfeld, Joan Rivers. They all owed their success to one good night on his stage. Others. What's truly sad, the more successful he became, the more alone felt. Fame should have filled the empty space left by his cold Nebraska childhood. Instead, it made that empty steeper and darker. Dick Cavett, another talk show host who knew Johnny personally, once described watching Carson at social events. He said, "You could actually see Johnny trying hard to be friendly with fans. It's desperate to get away from any real human interaction. The mask was becoming heavier every single day. Behind it, Johnny Carson was drowning in loneliness. He couldn't escape and couldn't share with anyone. But the real tragedy was just beginning Bezos. It's the same emotional walls that made him the king of late-night whereabout to destroy everything he should have cared about most. Johnny Carson was married 4 times. And every single marriage followed the same heartbreaking pattern. Love in the beginning, emotional distance in the middle, and terrible collapse at the end. Others. What's going to shock you about this love life? It wasn't that heckled in love. It's that he was scared of being loved back. His first marriage to college girlfriend Jody Walcott lasted 15 years and gave him 3 sons. But even then, friends could see the cracks. Johnny was already showing the same emotional distance he'd learned as a child. He provided for his family with money, but couldn't give them what they needed most, himself. The marriage was filled with arguments, affairs on both sides, and a growing feeling that Johnny was more married to his job than to his wife. When they divorced in 1963, it wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew them. What was surprising was how little light seemed to hurt Johnny emotionally. His second marriage to Joanne Copeland was supposed to be different. She was glamorous, sophisticated, part of the Hollywood scene. For a while, it looked like the perfect match, but the same patterns came back. Johnny would pull back emotionally whenever things got too close. Joanne Latardi described living with Johnny as like being married to a ghost. Hey, wastier in body, but emotionally unreable. When that marriage ended after 9 years, she said something that perfectly captured the Johnny Carson tragedy. He had no understanding of how to shore a love. But it was his third marriage that showed just how deep his emotional damage was. Joanna Holland Wassa, former model, beautiful and patient, for 10 years. She tried to crack the code of Johnny Carson's heart. She supported his career. She gave him space. She tried everything to reach the man behind the mask. And then, on their 10th wedding anniversary, she did something that shocked everyone, including Johnny himself. During what should have been a happy dinner, Joanna handed him divorce papers. She had planned it perfectly, knowing that a face-to-face conversation about their relationship might not be possible with a man who avoided emotional fights like sickness. The divorce cost Jenny over $20 million. A record breakings led up to time, but here's the thing that's going to break your heart. Even after 4 marriages, even after decades of trying and failing at love, Johnny never learned how to let someone nine. His 4th and final wife, Alexis Mass, was different from the others. She was younger, stayed out of the spotlight, and seemed to accept Johnny exactly as was. Distant, guarded, and emotionally unavailable. They stayed married until Johnny's death. But even she never truly got through those walls he'd spent a lifetime building. And then there were his children. His 3 sons who should have been the most important people in his life, but who instead became casualties off his emotional distance. Christopher and Corey, his older sons, learned to accept their father's limitations. They built their own lives, stayed out of the spotlight, maintained a polite but distant relationship with the man who gave them everything except the one thing they needed most, his emotional presence. But his youngest son, Rick, was different. Rick was creative, like his father, sensitive, and desperately in need of connection. He struggled with depression, with drug problems, with weight of being Johnny Carson's son, while never really knowing Johnny Carson, the father. The relationship between Johnny and Rick was filled with missed opportunities, unspoken words, and the kind of regret that eats a person alive from the inside. And that regret was about to become Johnny's greatest tragedy and the wound that would finally permanently close him off from the world. June 21st, 1991. It was supposed to be just another day, but it became the day that changed everything for Johnny Carson. The day his emotional walls couldn't protect him from the one thing he feared most: real, devastating, uncontrollable pain. His youngest son, Rick, was driving along a coastal highway in California. He was 39 years old, a nature photographer who found peace behind a camera lens, capturing the beauty of the world that seemed to escape him in his personal life. Rick had struggled for years with depression and drug problems. To eat of being Johnny Carson's son, combined with a father who couldn't connect emotionally, had taken its toll. But that day, he was working on a nature project, trying to photograph the landscape he loved. The car fell 1 to 5 feet down a hill. Carson was killed instantly. When Johnny got that tall, something inside him broke. For the first time in his adult life, the walls he'd built couldn't keep out pain. This wasn't a failed marriage I could walk away from, or a business fight he could control. This was his shield, and he was gone forever. Those who knew Johnny best said they had never seen him like this. He took 4 weeks off from The Tonight Show, an unprecedented break for a man who had rarely missed a single night in 30 years. But here's what's going to break your heart. Even in his deepest sadness, even facing the worst tragedy a parent can experience, Johnny Carson couldn't let people in. He refused to go to Rick's memorial service, reportedly to keep it from becoming a media circus. Even his son's death couldn't break down the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. When he returned to the show, he paid tribute to Rick in the only way knew how, from behind his desk, in front of millions of strangers, keeping his emotions carefully controlled. I showed a photograph of a sunset that Rick had taken and said simply that Rick was a good guy who made people want Tosmal when he was around. Doc Severson, his longtime band leader and one of the few people Johnny trusted, later said that after Rick's death, Johnny was never the same. The light went out of his eyes and it never came back. But Rick's death wasn't the only thing pushing Johnny deeper into being alone. There was another pattern in his life that was making his world smaller and smaller. Every day, his ability to hold grudges that lasted forever. And nobody learned this lesson more painfully than Joan Rivers. For years, Joan had been Johnny's protege, his most trusted guest host, and what many considered his closest friend in the business. He discovered her, promoted her, and made her his permanent guest host, essentially his heir apparent. In 1986, Fox offered Joan her own late-night show. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to step out of Johnny's shadow and become a star in her own right. But there was a problem. She was afraid to tell Johnny about it. Joanie knew Johnny well enough to know that he wouldn't take the news well. So, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took the deal with telling him first. When Johnny found out through someone else, he felt completely and utterly betrayed. She tried to call him to explain, but he wouldn't take her call. When she finally got through to him, he hung up on her. And then Johnny Carson did what Johnny Carson always did when he felt betrayed. He erased her from his life completely. He didn't just stop speaking to Joan Rivers. He banned her from The Tonight Show. For the rest of his Tamia's host, her name was forbidden. Staff members called it the Joan embargo. The consequences were devastating. Joan's show on Fox struggled, partly because Carson allegedly pressurized not to appear on it. The show was canceled after just over a year. Her husband Edgar, who took the blame for the show's failure, took his own life a few months later. Joan, shattered by grief and guilt, tried desperately to reach out to Johnny. She wrote letters. She sent sympathy notes when Rick died. Nothing worked. The door was locked forever. This wasn't just about business or betrayal. Something much darker about Johnny Carson. His need for absolute control and his inability to forgive. Once someone crossed him, they ceased to exist in his world. The pattern was becoming clear. Every relationship in Johnny's life followed the same path. Initial connection, growing distance, and then complete cutoff. He was systematically isolating himself from everyone who had ever mattered to him. By the time he announced his retirement in 1991, Johnny Carson had built himself a fortress of solitude. The death of Hisson had devastated him. Case grudges had cost him friendships, and his emotional walls had grown so high that almost nobody could reach him anymore. Knopf late night was preparing to become the loneliest man in America. On May 2, and 199,250 million Americans watched Johnny Carson say goodbye to The Tonight Show. It was one of the most watched TV events in history. But what happened next would shock everyone. They knew him. Johnny Carson didn't just retire from TV, had disappeared from the world completely. Everyone expected a gradual fade, maybe some guest appearances, hosting the Oscars, a few primetime specials. What they got instead was absolute silence. Johnny turned down every single interview request, every tribute, every public appearance. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. He retreated to his massive clifftop mansion in Malibu. It's a beautiful fortress overlooking the Pacific Ocean. For the millions who had watched him every night for 3 decades, Johnny Carson essentialized. To exist, his life fell into a quiet, controlled routine that revealed us how deep his need for isolation had come. He would spend hours reading, playing the drums, looking through his telescope at the stars. He played tennis regularly and took long solitary trips in his yacht. The isolation that Johnny chose was also a kind of prison. He had spent his entire adult life being Johnny Carson, a public character that required immense control to maintain DOTN. Retirement, he no longer had then nightly release of the show, which left him alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and his ghosts. Rick's death was still an unspoken sorrow that taunted him every day. The grudges he held, like the one against Joan Rivers, were never resolved, leaving wounds to fester in the silence. He had built his life like a fortress to keep the world out. But in his final years, he found himself trapped inside it. And then his body began to reflect what was happening to his spirit. Johnny had been a heavy smoker for most of his life, a habit you could see during the early years of The Tonight Show. He had quit in the 1970s. But the damage was already done. In March 1999, he suffered a severe heart attack and needed quadruple bypass surgery. Was a harsh reminder of his mortality, but true to form, he handled it with complete privacy. Really a single missed, no information to the public. In September 2002, the news broke that he had been diagnosed with emphysema, progressive brutal lung disease that slowly steals your breath. He confirmed the diagnosis but downplayed how serious it was, denying reports that he was terminally ill. But the emphysema was winning. As the disease progressed, Johnny's world shrank even more. The man who had once commanded a stage in front of millions was now trapped at home. His breathing labored, his energy gone. His final conversations were with a tiny circle of people. He spoke to his brother Dick and reportedly whispered truth about his condition. Thought those cigarettes had been his downfall. On the morning of January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was respirator failure due to emphysema. He was 79 years old. His wife Alexis was by his side, but beyond that small circle. As heady as he had lived his final 13 years in profound isolation. True to his lifelong need for privacy, there was no public memorial service. His body was cremated, and his ashes were given to his family. The man who had lived in the public eye for 3 decades was laid to rest in complete secrecy. The contrast was staggering. 50 million people had watched him leave TV, but only a handful saw him leave this world. When news of his death broke, tributes, poured in from around the world. President Bush issued a statement. Jay Leno called him the gold standard of TV. David Letterman gave, perhaps the most moving tribute, saying that all who came after Carson were pretenders, and that no one would ever match his achievement. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from understanding. What Johnny Carson's story really represents was a master of making people feel less alone.